Go back to your base, Commander. This villa belongs to your sister's family now. You are banned from stepping foot in here. My dad's ruthless declaration tore through my chest. As I dragged my exhausted feet home after 3 sleepless weeks of military drills, he and my sister Olivia were casually popping champagne on the rooftop terrace of my own villa. Pointing straight at my sweat-soaked military uniform, he sneered cruelly. "The military provides for you now. This house, I'm giving it to Olivia and her husband." My military duffel bag slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Over $110,000 that I had bled dry to save him had just bought me this brazen robbery. Swallowing the ultimate humiliation, I gave a freezing smile, nodded, and silently turned on my heel. They had no idea that when they gleefully dragged their suitcases in a few days later, I had already rigged a little surprise with 6 levels of psychological punishment. Just enough to force those greedy parasites to their knees, panicking and begging, "Please, make it stop." Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I reversed aggressively out of my own driveway, my knuckles turning stark white against the thick leather steering wheel. The heavy tires crunched over the gravel, a harsh grating sound that matched the violent tearing inside my chest. I absolutely refused to cry. Instead, the sickening celebratory pop of my dad's champagne cork up on the rooftop echoed endlessly in my skull, dragging my mind backward through 15 years of relentless financial drain. That specific sound of unearned luxury acted as a psychological tripwire. It threw me back to the very first time my dad looked at me not as a daughter to be proud of, but as an endless ATM to be exploited. I could vividly remember standing in my cramped, freezing military barracks during my early deployments, eating tasteless cold field rations out of a tin can, while staring at a bank statement that made my stomach churn. My entire combat paycheck had been siphoned away to fund his lavish lifestyle back home. Every cent of that money I had earned, crawling through mud, running on no sleep for 72 hours straight, and leading supply convoys through hostile corridors where a single wrong turn could end in a body bag. Every single dollar had vanished into his pocket without so much as a thank you, without a single phone call asking if I was safe, without even the basic human decency of pretending he cared about the daughter funding his comfort. The nauseating scent of their expensive champagne seemed to linger in the car's air conditioning vents, choking the oxygen out of the cabin. It was the unmistakable scent of absolute betrayal. I gripped the steering wheel even tighter, aggressively shifting gears as I merged onto the dark highway. The memory violently surfaced of the humid summer day I handed over $35,000 in cold hard cash for a brand new top-of-the-line SUV. My chronically unemployed sister Olivia and her utterly useless husband David had outright refused to take public transit like normal struggling adults, claiming it was beneath their dignity. I remember standing in the blindingly bright car dealership, exhausted from a 48-hour logistics shift, handing Olivia the heavy set of keys. She didn't offer a single word of genuine gratitude. Not one. Instead, she haughtily adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses, clicked her tongue impatiently, and loudly complained to the embarrassed salesman that the leather interior wasn't the exact shade of beige she had specifically demanded. She turned to my dad and rolled her eyes at me as if I had personally insulted her by spending $35,000 on the wrong color seat. My dad had stood right behind her, arms crossed in his tailored suit, nodding in stern agreement with her complaint. He didn't tell her to be grateful. He didn't tell her to thank the sister who had just handed her the keys to a brand new vehicle while she contributed absolutely nothing to this family but noise and demands. He acted as if my hard-earned combat pay was his divine patriarchal right to distribute to his favorite golden child. I was just the obedient soldier funding their delusions of grandeur, and my only purpose in this family was to keep the money flowing. The winding highway darkened, perfectly matching the descent of my bitter memories. I recalled the frantic late-night phone call a few months prior to the car incident. I was stationed overseas, deep in a classified logistics operation, coordinating fuel shipments for 3 carrier groups in contested waters, when my secure line rang at 2 in the morning. It was my dad's voice, trembling and pathetic, begging for exactly $25,000 to pay off underground gambling debts before his violent creditors destroyed his life. He didn't open with an apology. He didn't confess his addiction or ask for help getting clean. Instead, he weaponized his high blood pressure, screaming through the static that my refusal to pay would literally cause his heart to explode and leave my sister an orphan. He painted himself as the victim, as always turning his self-inflicted catastrophe into my emergency. He didn't care that I was in a restricted communication zone. He didn't care that the call itself could have triggered a security review. I had to bypass my own strict security clearance protocols, risking a severe reprimand from my commanding officers and potentially compromising an active operation just to wire the emergency funds through an unsecured civilian channel in time to save his worthless skin. My executive officer pulled me aside the next morning and asked me point blank why I had accessed a non-military financial system during an operational blackout period. I lied to protect my father. I put my career on the line for a man who gambled away money in basement card rooms while I coordinated million-dollar supply chains in combat theaters. I paid for his disgusting sins with the money I bled for, with the reputation I built over a decade of flawless service, and he repaid my ultimate loyalty by stealing my only sanctuary. I forcefully pulled my car over onto the dark gravel shoulder of the mountain highway, throwing the gear into park with a violent shove. My chest heaved violently against the restrictive nylon of the seatbelt. The sheer staggering volume of my financial bleeding, well over $110,000, systematically extorted over the years under the guise of family duty, weighed on my shoulders like a physical suffocating anchor, dragging me toward the bottom of a black ocean. I slammed my closed fist against the hard plastic of the dashboard once, twice, a third time. The dull thud perfectly mirrored the sound of my heavy duffel bag dropping onto the stolen villa's floor just an hour before. The tears of a broken daughter absolutely refused to fall. The military had trained that reflex out of me a long time ago. Instead, my deep sorrow violently hardened, crystallizing into a cold, hyper-focused, tactical realization that cut through the fog of 15 years of blind loyalty. I owed these parasites absolutely nothing. Not a dollar. Not a tear. Not another second of my dignity. The bloodline was officially dead. I put the car back in drive and accelerated fiercely into the pitch-black night. Returning to my sterile, organized San Diego apartment hours later, the silence of the empty rooms greeted me like a held breath. I dropped my keys on the counter with a sharp metallic clink, my eyes immediately locking onto the perfectly folded American flag sitting inside the heavy glass display case on the mantel. The flag was positioned exactly where the military chaplain had placed it in my hands 3 years ago, the fabric still crisp, the folds still razor-sharp, carrying the full weight of a nation's gratitude for a sacrifice my family never once honored. I stepped forward, my fingers slowly tracing the polished wooden frame. The memory of James's military funeral hit me right in the chest, stealing the air from my lungs like a physical blow. The deafening, echoing crack of the 21-gun salute. The somber faces of his battle-hardened platoon standing at attention in the pouring rain, each man carrying the burden of losing a brother they would have died for without hesitation. The bugler playing taps each note, hanging in the cold air like a prayer. It was a world of profound honor and ultimate sacrifice that my dad and Olivia could never comprehend, a world where loyalty was not a word you weaponized, but a covenant you honored with your life. Yet in a sick twist of fate, those civilian parasites were the ones who ultimately reaped all the financial benefits of his tragic death, while I was left holding nothing but a piece of folded cloth, an empty bed, and a promise that would enslave me for years. I slowly sat on the very edge of the perfectly made bed, closing my tired eyes. Instantly, I could smell the suffocating chemical stench of hospital antiseptics burning the inside of my nostrils. I could still clearly hear James's raspy, fading voice in the sterile ICU 3 years ago, struggling through the ventilator tubes, his chest rising and falling in shallow mechanical rhythms that had nothing to do with life, and everything to do with the machine's stubborn refusal to let go. His dying words, the honorable, terribly naive wish of a combat officer who believed in the inherent goodness of family above all else because he had never met mine. He squeezed my trembling hand with his remaining strength and whispered, "Take care of the family." That single breathless promise became the invisible, unbreakable steel chain my dad used to drag me through the dirt for years. He memorized those words. He rehearsed them. Every single time I tried to say no to their extortion, every single time I pushed back against a demand that crossed a line, my dad would drop James's name like a grenade into the conversation. James wanted you to take care of us," he would say, his voice dripping with manufactured grief. And the ghost of my husband would stand silently in the corner of the room, watching me surrender my financial boundaries one more time in the name of a dead war hero's honor. My dad knew exactly what he was doing when he invoked that promise. He had turned my husband's last breath into a leash. The worst memory rose violently to the surface. Just 3 short weeks after burying James in Arlington, before the flowers on his grave had even begun to wilt, my dad called me in a manufactured panic about an impending bank foreclosure on his property. His voice cracked with theatrical desperation, claiming the bank was going to throw him and Olivia and her children out on the street within 48 hours. He didn't ask about my grief. He didn't ask if I was eating or sleeping, or if the nightmares had started yet. He called because the checks had stopped coming and his safety net was unraveling. I remember standing in the excessively air-conditioned bank lobby, still wearing my conservative black mourning clothes, the same dress I had worn to the funeral because I hadn't had the energy to change. My eyes were swollen and raw from crying. The bank teller looked at me with visible pity, glancing between my face and the mourning dress as I signed over a massive $50,000 cashier's check, draining nearly every cent of the military death benefit and my personal savings to secure a permanent roof over my dad and Olivia's heads. They eagerly snatched the heavily stamped deed from the banker's desk, grinning widely without showing a single shred of concern for my hollow, grieving eyes staring right through them. Olivia actually pulled out her phone and started texting someone while I was still signing the paperwork, completely disinterested in the sacrifice being made 6 inches from her face. My dad folded the deed into his jacket pocket and patted it twice, the way a man pats his wallet after a good deal. They saw James's tragic death not as a catastrophic loss, but as a highly lucrative opportunity to fully weaponize my widow's vulnerability for their own gain. $50,000. 3 weeks after I buried the only man who ever loved me unconditionally, and they smiled while they took it. I stood up abruptly from the bed, forcefully breaking eye contact with the flag case, and turning to look directly into the full-length mirror on the closet door. The reflection staring back was no longer a grieving, manipulable widow drowning in guilt. It was no longer an obedient, fearful daughter begging for validation from people who saw her as nothing but a revenue stream. It was a hardened, decorated Navy commander with 15 years of service medals pinned to her chest and a spine forged in combat zones where real threats had real consequences. I squared my shoulders and took a deep, tactical breath, holding the oxygen in for 4 deliberate seconds, letting the oppressive ghost of my promise finally evaporate from my lungs. James died believing they were a family worth saving. He was tragically wrong, and I would no longer pay for his mistake with my sanity or my future. I reached out and turned the glass flag case around so it faced the wall. The portrait of sacrifice, the symbol that had chained me for 3 years, disappeared into the shadows. The agonizing era of endless sacrifice was officially over. Early the next morning, I walked through the heavy, reinforced steel doors of the San Diego Naval Base. The rhythmic, synchronized salutes and the crisp, respectful greetings from the passing enlisted personnel washed over me like a healing current. "Morning, Commander." Every voice carried genuine respect earned through years of flawless performance, under extreme pressure not extorted through guilt or emotional manipulation. The familiar smell of bitter black coffee and metallic gun oil filled the air, instantly grounding my frayed nerves and resetting my internal compass. This controlled environment was my true home. The strict discipline, the unshakable mutual respect, the absolute clarity of rank and mission, the understanding that every member of this base would take a bullet for the person standing next to them without asking for a penny in return. It was exactly everything my chaotic, greedy blood family actively denied me. Here I was, judged purely by my tactical brilliance, my logistical execution, and my unwavering ability to protect my unit, not by how much cash I could blindly wire to a parasitic relative demanding another bailout. The sheer contrast between the loyalty of strangers in uniform and the treachery of my own flesh and blood made my jaw clench in bitter realization. The people who shared my DNA had never once shown me a fraction of the respect that these sailors offered me every single morning. That truth burned, but it also clarified everything. I marched into my private office and sat at my heavy metal desk, immediately pulling up my encrypted contacts list. My thumb hovered deliberately over the name Michael Vance. He was a formidable former JAG officer who had transitioned into a brilliant real estate attorney, and he was my closest confidant outside the chain of command. I vividly recalled the intense, grueling military tribunal a few years back, where he stood shoulder to shoulder with me against a massive bureaucratic nightmare that threatened to permanently derail my entire career. A falsified supply report had been pinned on my unit, and the investigative panel wanted blood. Michael dissected their case with surgical precision, exposing the real culprit within 72 hours. He didn't flinch under the pressure of 3 hostile admirals, and he didn't ask for a single dime in return for his absolute loyalty. He simply told me that this was what brothers do. He was the ultimate legal shield. A brother forged not in the random lottery of DNA, but in the brutal, unforgiving trenches of military law. I pressed his name and lifted the phone to my ear. The War Council was about to begin. My mind immediately shifted to my next crucial asset, Ethan Wright. He was my old civilian neighbor from the housing block near the base, but more importantly, a former naval electronic warfare officer with a security clearance that would make most government officials nervous. I remembered the night he flawlessly bypassed a corrupted base logistics server just to help me meet an impossible high-stakes deployment deadline, working through an entire night on nothing but energy drinks and pure stubbornness, risking his own prestigious clearance simply because a fellow officer needed immediate backup. No questions asked, no favors owed. Ethan was a man who spoke in encrypted code, severe consequences, and absolute unquestioning loyalty. He viewed every obstacle as an enemy target that needed to be swiftly neutralized, without hesitation or mercy, and he grinned when the odds were stacked against him. He was the perfect digital weapon to help me reclaim my stolen territory. I typed a short coded message to his secure line and hit send. Within 30 seconds, the reply came back. A single word. Ready. I leaned back in my ergonomic tactical chair, systematically organizing the physical, heavily stamped files of my Lake Tahoe property into a neat, perfectly squared stack on the desk. The original deed, the tax receipts, the renovation invoices I had personally funded, the insurance documents bearing only my name. Every piece of paper was a bullet in the magazine I was about to load. The profound sense of isolation that had choked me the night before completely vanished. I was no longer fighting a lonely, miserable war of attrition against my dad's endless greed. I had an elite team of highly trained specialists at my absolute fingertips, and every single one of them understood the code of loyalty that my blood relatives had never even learned to spell. I took a slow sip of my scalding black coffee, my cold eyes locked dead onto the property deed, bearing my name in bold, legal print. My dad arrogantly thought he had conquered an empty, undefended house. He didn't realize he had just declared total war on a fully operational military command, and every officer in my unit was already sharpening their weapons. Several nights later, I was standing alone in the cavernous command center, staring blankly at a glowing logistics map on the wall, tracking the movement of supply vessels across the Pacific, when my phone aggressively vibrated on the steel table. The screen lit up with a name I no longer associated with family, John Martin. I slowly answered the call, maintaining a pathetic, lingering sliver of hope for something resembling a genuine apology, or at the very least a shred of shame. Instead, his voice dripped with arrogant dictatorial venom, echoing sharply off the cold concrete walls of the command center. Listen carefully, Lauren. I've taken back the Lake Tahoe villa. I'm giving it to Olivia's family permanently. They're moving in this week. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't suggest a conversation. He decreed it like a medieval king seizing a peasant's land, fully expecting the peasant to bow and thank him for the privilege of being robbed. The sheer audacity of his statement froze the air in my lungs. He spoke as if my name on the legal deed was nothing more than a clerical error. He was graciously correcting, firmly believing that his patriarchal authority trumped the law itself, firmly convinced that he had the absolute right to evict me from the very house my blood, sweat, and combat deployments paid for. My grip tightened dangerously around my thick ceramic coffee mug. He aggressively gaslighted me, his voice rising in volume to drown out any resistance I might offer, steamrolling through my silence with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone in his household. You're a military officer. You live on base year-round. Everything from food to clothes is subsidized. You don't have a husband or kids. No own family. What the hell do you need that big villa for? Give it to your sister immediately. She needs a good environment to raise her kids. Each word landed like a calculated blow designed to make me feel worthless, unnecessary, and expendable. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached, the memories of the $25,000 gambling bailout and the $35,000 SUV burning through my skull like acid. He didn't flinch at any of it. He didn't pause. Instead, he ruthlessly weaponized my dead husband. That's your duty. Before your husband died, he told you to take care of the family. You're betraying your promise to James. The ceramic mug literally exploded in my fist under the immense pressure, the thick handle snapping clean off, jagged shards slicing into my palm. Warm blood dripped steadily from the deep cuts onto the sterile command center floor, pooling in small, dark circles around my boots. The pain barely registered. The mention of James's name from this man's mouth, this parasite who had never worn a uniform, never risked his life for anything beyond a poker table, using my dead husband's dying breath as a crowbar to pry open my wallet. That was the pain that cut deeper than any ceramic shard ever could. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my voice dropping to a frequency that had silenced insubordinate officers and hostile negotiators across 3 continents. Listen to me clearly, I hissed, freezing the air in the room with absolute malice. There will be no more concessions. This conversation is over. I terminated the call, watching the screen go black, while the blood ran freely between my fingers and dripped onto the cold floor. 2 grueling afternoons later, the phone buzzed again. While I was reviewing deployment logistics in my office, my right hand, now heavily bandaged in white gauze, that was already showing small spots of red, where the deepest cuts refused to fully close. I clasped my bloody bandaged hand behind my back in a strict military parade rest and accepted the call with my left. It was Olivia. The fake hysterical sobbing started instantly on cue, a well-rehearsed theatrical performance she had been perfecting since childhood, the same routine she used at age 12 to convince our dad that I had stolen her allowance when she had spent it on candy and wanted more. "Sister, please don't do this to Dad," she whimpered expertly, adjusting her tone to project maximum frailty and victimhood. "He has high blood pressure. You made him very angry. We are really struggling. David can't find a job. The kids are crying. Living costs are expensive. You're an officer. You don't understand the hardships of a nursing mother. We are blood sisters. Blood is thicker than water." I listened to the entire performance without moving a single muscle, my face completely devoid of expression. I could literally hear her husband David whispering urgent instructions in the background, feeding her lines like a cheap stage director coaching a failing actress. "Tell her about the kids," he hissed, his voice poorly muffled by his hand over the speaker. "Mention the blood pressure again." It was a synchronized, calculated, emotional assault designed to drain my bank account one more time. The same script, the same tears, the same weaponized guilt. The only thing that had changed was their level of desperation. I stood perfectly still, staring blankly at a blinking green radar screen on the wall, completely numb to her pathetic manipulation. Every sob was a lie. Every tear was a tool. I realized with absolute clarity that her crying was nothing but a tactical smokescreen for extortion. "Are you done crying?" I asked, my voice devoid of a single drop of human empathy, slicing through her act like a scalpel through wet paper. The sobbing stopped instantly. Olivia choked loudly, immediately dropping the helpless, fragile mother routine like a mask ripped from her face. Her true, greedy, entitled nature violently snapped to the surface, her voice transforming from a whimper into a snarl in less than a second. Why are you so cold-blooded? Dad has made his decision. This Sunday my family will move into the villa. Whether you agree or not, Dad said you have no right to stop this family." I looked down at my bandaged hand, feeling the dull throb of my own heartbeat pulsing against the gauze, a slow, steady rhythm that reminded me I was still alive, and still in complete control of this situation. "Try it," I said, my voice dropping to a register that would make a seasoned interrogator pause. "But remember, every trespassing action has its consequences." The call went dead. The transition was finally complete. The compliant victim, who had spent 15 years writing checks and swallowing tears, was gone, buried alongside the broken ceramic mug and the bloodstains on the command center floor. The commander was fully awake. The morning immediately following Olivia's hysterical ultimatum, before the sun even breached the horizon over the naval base, I stood motionless in front of my barracks mirror. I buttoned my crisp navy uniform, ensuring every medal and ribbon was perfectly aligned, each one a physical record of sacrifice these civilians could never fathom. The Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal, the Navy Achievement Medal with 3 gold stars. Each pin represented a moment where I chose duty over comfort, honor over profit, and service over self. I pulled out my encrypted smartphone and navigated straight to the message threads. With cold, mechanical precision, I systematically deleted every single manipulative text, every guilt-tripping voicemail, and every digital family photo containing my dad and sister. 15 years of emotional ammunition wiped clean in under 3 minutes. I was actively purging the psychological battlefield of all emotional debris. I could not afford the luxury of sentimentality, nor could I allow a single ounce of hesitation to cloud my judgment when preparing for a siege. Using my strictly accumulated military leave time, I marched directly into the upscale quiet law office of Michael Vance. I dropped a massive, heavy stack of property deeds, bank statements, tax filings, and wire transfer receipts onto his polished mahogany desk, leaning over it like a combat general studying a hostile map before a dawn assault. I need to establish an armored legal bunker for my assets. An invasion is happening, and the enemy is my own family. Michael's sharp eyes narrowed in instant, solemn understanding. He pulled the stack toward him, flipping through the documents with the focused intensity of a man defusing an explosive device. He had prosecuted corrupt generals and defended soldiers facing life sentences, but he told me that afternoon, his voice low and steady, that the cruelty of a parent systematically exploiting their own child's grief made those criminals look like amateurs. We spent 6 grueling hours sealing every conceivable legal loophole, drafting irreversible power of attorney blocks, revoking every emergency access my dad had ever been granted to my accounts, and erecting bureaucratic barriers so impossibly high that not even a ghost with a law degree could cross them. By the time we finished, my financial borders were fortified with enough legal firepower to withstand a federal siege. Fast forward to the weekend. Olivia's hysterical screaming threat on the phone had inadvertently provided me with the exact tactical intelligence I needed, the kind of intelligence that in a military operation would require weeks of surveillance to obtain. She had handed it to me for free, out of pure arrogance. Their invasion was definitively scheduled for Sunday afternoon. I locked myself in the base's desolate, soundproof tactical briefing room, ensuring absolute privacy. I aggressively unrolled the massive architectural blueprints for the Lake Tahoe villa across the cold steel table, pinning the curling corners down with heavy brass compasses. The shadows in the quiet room stretched long and dark under the flickering fluorescent lights. My phone buzzed once. A photo from Olivia showing 4 packed suitcases lined up by her front door, with a taunting caption that read, "See you Sunday, sis." I stared at the smug confidence in that message for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the last trace of doubt evaporate from my bloodstream, then placed the phone face down on the table and picked up my red marker. Under the harsh neon glow, I uncapped a thick red tactical marker, the sharp smell of alcohol ink hitting my nose with the familiar bite of a weapon being prepared. I didn't draw comfortable furniture layouts or cozy living spaces. I drew lethal, unavoidable choke points, infrared motion sensor grids, and calculated acoustic blind spots designed to maximize disorientation in every room simultaneously. I was applying non-lethal military-grade riot control tactics directly to the architectural layout of my own luxurious living room. Every corner of that villa became a kill zone on paper. Every hallway became a choke point. Every bedroom became an inescapable cell. A chilling predator's smile slowly spread across my face as I mapped out the devastating crossfire zones for the high-decibel acoustic weapons I was about to install. I was going to build a flawless, inescapable fortress. Let them come and claim their prize. This level of calculated betrayal from your own family forces you to become someone unrecognizable just to survive. If you've ever had to build cold walls to protect yourself from your own blood, please like this video and tell me in the comments, what was the final straw that made you fight back? Early the next morning, I pulled my truck up to Ethan Wright's secluded house on the outskirts of the city. The driveway was lined with old surveillance equipment and decommissioned antenna arrays, the front yard of a man who never truly left the electronic battlefield. When I slid the red-inked blueprints across his cluttered kitchen table, pushing aside coffee mugs and circuit boards, and briefed him on the full parameters of what I was calling Operation Storm, The former cyber warfare officer grinned with the raw, chaotic excitement of a predator being unchained after years in a cage. He cracked his knuckles, leaned over the drawings with his reading glasses perched on his nose, and immediately started listing the specific equipment we needed from 3 different military surplus suppliers across the state. For the next grueling 48 hours, my beautiful, peaceful lake house was radically transformed into a heavily secured installation. We wore heavy tactical gloves, aggressively ripping open the pristine, expensive drywall to bury heavy-duty industrial batteries deep in the concrete basement foundation. We spent hours hardwiring intense strobe lights into every ceiling fixture, calibrating the flash frequency to the exact hertz range that induces maximum visual disorientation without causing permanent damage. We programmed directional acoustic emitters directly into the vaulted wooden framework above the living room and master bedroom, each one capable of producing sound pressure levels that would make a grown man drop to his knees and cover his ears. As the sun began to set on the final day of grueling preparation, the electronic perimeter was primed and humming with a terrifying latent electrical energy that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. Every wire was buried and invisible. Every sensor was calibrated to a fraction of a degree. Every speaker was positioned for maximum psychological impact, and the entire system was linked to a single remote execution command accessible from my encrypted laptop in San Diego. I stood out on the wooden porch holding a heavy industrial drill. With 3 loud, definitive, echoing grinds that scattered birds from the nearby pines, I secured a thick, reflective metal sign directly into the center of the beautiful oak front door. The sign read in bold red letters, "Automated Surveillance Area. Enter at your own risk." It was the final, undeniable legal checkpoint, the last chance for any rational human being to turn around, walk away, and preserve what was left of their dignity. The trap was set, armed and waiting in the absolute silence of the woods. I packed my heavy tools into the trunk of my car and drove away without looking back, leaving the silent, heavily armed fortress to wait patiently for its victims. The highly anticipated day of the invasion finally arrived. I was sitting in the absolute darkness of my San Diego apartment, my cold eyes glued to 3 live high-definition camera feeds, streaming simultaneously from the Lake Tahoe property on 3 separate monitors arranged in a semicircle on my desk. Exactly on their predictable schedule, the $35,000 SUV I bought them aggressively swerved into my gravel driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. My dad strutted out of the driver's seat first, his chest puffed out like a conquering king arriving to claim his new castle. He adjusted the collar of his jacket and surveyed the property with a smug, proprietary gaze that made my blood simmer beneath my skin. Olivia and David practically skipped to the trunk, laughing loudly, hauling out massive, heavy suitcases packed for a permanent, luxurious stay, funded entirely by my combat deployments and my dead husband's death benefits. My stepmother Susan marched haughtily up the front steps behind them, her expensive heels crunching loudly and obnoxiously on the gravel path. She spotted the heavy metal warning sign bolted firmly to the oak door and stopped. She squinted at the bold red letters, and her heavily made-up face twisted in ugly, deeply offended contempt, as if the sign itself was a personal insult to her inflated sense of entitlement. "What kind of garbage is this? Does that bitch think a sign can scare anyone?" She barked angrily, violently gripping the metal edges with both manicured hands, ripping the sign clean off the door with a shriek of bending screws and splintering wood, and throwing it disrespectfully into the dirt, like a piece of trash. My dad laughed dismissively from the bottom of the steps, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeve, as if the whole affair was beneath him. "Ignore it. She's just throwing a tantrum because she got kicked out." "Open the door, David." David fumbled eagerly with the spare key, his thick fingers shaking with giddy excitement as he jammed it into the lock. The door swung wide open, and all 4 of them poured into my home like a flood of unchecked entitlement, dragging suitcases across the polished hardwood floors I had personally refinished 2 summers ago. I sat entirely motionless in the dark glow of my monitors, watching every single one of them disappear inside the house, their silhouettes shrinking into the warmly lit interior. My index finger hovered dangerously over the glowing red execution key on my keyboard. The sign they ripped down and threw in the dirt was their last warning. They had chosen their fate. Night fell heavily over the dense pine forests of Lake Tahoe, cloaking the stolen villa in complete darkness. It was exactly 10 in the evening. Through the highly sensitive thermal cameras displayed across my glowing monitors, I watched four glowing orange silhouettes settling comfortably into my expensive king-sized beds, pulling my clean sheets over their bodies, dreaming peacefully of their stolen, unearned victory. They were completely relaxed, utterly oblivious to the massive electrical currents humming just inches beneath the polished hardwood floorboards beneath their stolen pillows. I took a slow, deep, calculated breath, leaning back in my command chair and lifting my mug of black coffee that perfectly matched the absolute darkness of the room. The sheer arrogance of them sleeping in my house in my bed under my roof, entirely unbothered by the $110,000 they had systematically bled from my life over 15 years, eliminated any lingering hesitation in my mind. There was no guilt. There was no second guessing. There was only the cold, clean certainty of a commander executing a mission that had been planned down to the last wire. I leaned forward, the harsh blue light of the screens reflecting in my cold, unblinking eyes, my gaze narrowing into a focused squint. I pressed my index finger firmly onto the glowing red key. Execute. In less than a second, the peaceful villa violently erupted into a mechanized, inescapable nightmare. Blinding blood-red tactical strobe lights simultaneously ignited at brutally high frequencies in every single room, the pulsing light so intense and so fast it immediately induced severe visual vertigo, destroying all spatial orientation, making it impossible to tell a wall from a doorway or a floor from a ceiling. Simultaneous ear-splitting air raid sirens shattered the silence of the mountains, the sound waves bouncing off the lake and amplifying across the valley, layered expertly with weaponized low-frequency infrasound waves specifically calibrated to cause intense nausea, deep, primal dread, and blind animalistic panic in anyone within range. The ceiling fire sprinklers activated with a loud, violent hiss, unleashing a freezing, relentless, soaking mist over their screaming, thrashing bodies, drenching everything in seconds. Through the silent camera feeds, I watched the absolute chaos unfold, with the detached professionalism of an officer observing a controlled field exercise. My dad violently rolled off the master bed in shock, clutching his ears in pure agony as he hit the wet hardwood floor, his mouth wide open in a scream I could not hear through the muted monitors. Susan was crawling blindly on her hands and knees through the violently flashing red hallways, sobbing hysterically, her expensive nightgown soaked and clinging to her shivering body, slipping and sliding helplessly on the flooded floors as she searched desperately for a way out that did not exist. Downstairs, Olivia and David sprinted frantically for the heavy oak front door, slipping and screaming over the deafening blare of the sirens crashing into furniture and walls in the disorienting red strobe flashes. David shoved Olivia aside with his elbow, scrambling to reach the door handle first, his self-preservation instinct instantly overriding any pretense of being a protective husband or father. But the military-grade electromagnetic locks that Ethan had installed were permanently fused shut the moment the system activated. There was absolutely no escape. They were trapped inside a highly advanced automated anti-theft security system of their own, making a consequence of ripping down the only warning sign that could have saved them. For 6 agonizing, relentless hours, I sat back in my quiet command center and simply watched. I watched their arrogant entitlement and smug superiority completely dissolve, layer by layer, into pathetic, exhausted whimpers, as they were forced to huddle together in the freezing, violently flashing living room, soaking wet, unable to see clearly, unable to hear each other over the sirens, and unable to form a single coherent thought. Every single tear they shed, every terrified scream they released into the flashing red void was a long overdue receipt for the $110,000 they ruthlessly stole from me. They were finally experiencing a fraction of the paralyzing fear and helplessness they had forced me to live with for 15 straight years. And I did not look away once. As the sun finally crested over the mountains, bathing the lake in a peaceful, pale morning glow, the automated security system disengaged on its pre-programmed timer exactly as designed. The heavy front doors popped open with a soft mechanical hiss, releasing the locks with a click that echoed through the silent-soaked house. The 4 of them crawled out onto the perfectly trimmed front lawn on their hands and knees, soaked to the bone, shivering, violently pale as actual corpses, their eyes bloodshot, their voices gone from hours of screaming and utterly, irreparably broken in every way that mattered. My cell phone rang almost instantly. It was my dad. He was screaming hysterically, but his voice was hoarse, raspy, and entirely stripped of its usual patriarchal authority. The commanding king who had decreed my eviction from my own rooftop was gone. In his place was a terrified, shivering old man who had just spent 6 hours trapped in his own greed. I answered the call, maintaining a crisp, utterly professional military tone with a razor-thin edge of sarcasm. Sorry, Dad, it must be a glitch in the automated anti-theft system. The house has owner recognition sensors. Next time, please don't break into someone else's house. Have a peaceful morning. I terminated the connection before he could utter another word. I set the phone down on the desk, took a long sip of fresh coffee, and let the quiet settle around me. The morning following their humiliating escape, my perimeter cameras caught David desperately pulling a civilian locksmith's van into the driveway. He pointed aggressively and frantically at the front door, gesturing for the man to break them back inside, his voice carrying over the microphone in panicked, incoherent bursts. But faced with Ethan's heavily encrypted military-grade security grid and the visibly scorched wires running along the doorframe from the intentional system overload the night before, the civilian locksmith physically paled. He took one long look at the advanced wiring, shook his head vigorously, backed away from the door with his hands raised, refused to touch the lock, and literally ran back to his truck, his tires spitting gravel as he sped away without looking back. David stood alone on the porch, staring at the impenetrable door with the slack jaw of a man who had just realized he was fighting a war he was never equipped to win. Defeated physically, and realizing with mounting panic that they absolutely could not brute force their way past my high-tech defenses, my family decided to resort to the dirtiest, most cowardly tactic they had left in their arsenal. If they could not break down my physical doors, they would try to break down my military career. Hours later, under the heavy cover of darkness, violent, erratic pounding severely shook the thin door of my quiet San Diego apartment. I swung it open without hesitation, without checking the peephole, because I had been expecting this visit since the moment the locks released that morning. My dad and Olivia were standing there in the fluorescent-lit hallway. They looked like drowned rats, still visibly shivering and deeply traumatized by the long night of strobing red lights and freezing water, their clothes wrinkled and unwashed, their hair matted and damp. But their eyes were feral with the unhinged, dangerous desperation of cornered animals who had nothing left to lose but their pride. My dad stepped forward, aggressively pointing a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face, screaming so loudly his voice echoed down the entire hallway, and a neighbor's door cracked open 3 units down. "Do you dare use that demonic stuff to torture your own flesh and blood, Father? I will file a report to the court-martial. I will accuse you of domestic abuse, destroy your military honor. You will lose your rank." "Lauren." Olivia pushed her way forward past my dad, her face twisted in venomous, ugly hatred, wiping her running nose with her wrinkled sleeve. "You are truly a demon. We will cut ties with you. You will die alone. No one will ever acknowledge you again, unless you immediately transfer the villa to our names to compensate for mental damages." The absolute audacity of her statement was breathtaking. They had broken into my legally owned property after ripping down a posted security warning, and they were standing at my door demanding I compensate them for the consequences of their own criminal trespass. They actually believed the threat of public ruin and military disgrace would break me. They genuinely thought I was still the terrified, grieving widow who would do anything to keep the peace and beg for their toxic approval. They thought their blackmail was a winning hand. They were catastrophically wrong. I stood absolutely motionless in the doorway, folding my arms tightly across my chest in a rigid, impenetrable military stance that I had perfected over 15 years of commanding sailors and staring down hostile foreign officers across negotiation tables. I looked down at the two of them with profound, undisturbed disgust, refusing to raise my voice, refusing to show a single ounce of fear, refusing to give them even the smallest emotional reaction they could weaponize. "Are you two done with this circus?" I asked, my voice echoing with devastating cold authority that completely halted their screaming mid-breath. They both froze, their mouths hanging open, stunned into absolute silence by my refusal to flinch. "Want to sue? Go ahead. But remember, to step into a court-martial you must prove legal ownership. And I declare this war has ended the military way." I slammed the heavy door right in their faces, the deadbolt clicking shut with the finality of a chambered bullet sliding into the barrel. Tomorrow, I would deliver the final fatal strike. The morning after the pathetic hallway ambush, we sat inside the pristine, imposing, and completely silent notary office of William Hayes, a senior notary and former military intelligence officer whose walls were lined with framed commendations and whose desk was clean enough to perform surgery on. My dad, Susan, Olivia, and David marched through the double glass doors with their chests puffed out, acting exactly like victorious generals arriving to accept a surrender. They were utterly convinced that the threat to my prestigious military career, the specter of a court-martial investigation, had forced me to the negotiating table to beg for their mercy. My dad aggressively pulled out a heavy leather chair, its legs scraping loudly against the polished marble floor, and violently slapped his open palm flat against the thick glass table to assert his dominance in the room. "No more beating around the bush. Sign the villa transfer papers. If not this afternoon, the accusation letter will be on your commanding officer's desk." He glared at me across the table with the smug confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards, fully expecting me to slide a pen across the glass and weep in defeat. I sat perfectly straight across from them, fully adorned in my immaculate navy dress uniform, every brass button polished, my service medals gleaming brilliantly under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. I took a slow, completely unbothered sip of my hot tea, the ceramic cup steady in my hand, not even blinking at his loud theatrical outburst. William Hayes, maintaining the freezing, terrifying professional detachment of a former military intelligence officer who had conducted interrogations in classified facilities, far more intimidating than this glass-walled office, slid a massive, heavily sealed legal dossier to the exact center of the glass table. The dossier landed with a heavy, decisive thud that silenced the room. "Sorry, Mr. Martin," William stated firmly, his authoritative voice instantly slicing through the thick tension in the room like a blade through silk. "Commander Martin cannot transfer the villa to your family, because she is no longer its owner." The oxygen was instantly and violently vacuumed from the room. Every face on their side of the table went white. My dad's jaw literally dropped open in shock, his palm still frozen flat against the glass where he had slapped it seconds ago. "What do you mean?" he stammered, the arrogant, flushed color completely draining from his face, leaving him pale and trembling like a man who had just been told his bank account was empty. I leaned forward, slowly planting my elbows firmly on the glass table, my cold eyes locking onto his with lethal, unwavering precision. "Last Monday morning, I signed the papers donating the entire Lake Tahoe villa to the Navy Veterans Support Fund. The contract is legally binding and irreversible. In return, I retain the exclusive right to use that property for life." The bomb detonated perfectly. The millions in future inheritance they had salivated over, schemed for, fought for, stolen for, and destroyed family bonds for vanished completely into thin air with a single sentence. There was nothing to sue for, nothing to transfer, nothing to negotiate, nothing to steal. The property now belonged to a federally recognized charitable organization dedicated to supporting the veterans who had actually served, and no amount of screaming, crying, or threatening court-martials would change a single word of the legally binding federally registered contract sitting in the center of the table. Susan gasped so hard she choked on her own saliva, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes bulging in raw, unfiltered disbelief. David sat frozen in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, unable to process the magnitude of what had just detonated in his face. My dad tried to stand, but his legs buckled and he collapsed back into the leather chair, gripping the armrests with white knuckles, his entire body trembling as the full weight of his defeat crushed down on his shoulders. Olivia collapsed forward over the table into genuine, agonizing, ugly sobs of absolute despair, her forehead hitting the glass with a dull, hollow thud, her manicured nails clawing uselessly at the polished surface. These were not her rehearsed crocodile tears. These were the raw, uncontrollable sobs of a woman who had just watched her entire parasitic future evaporate before her bloodshot eyes. William Hayes calmly gathered the dossier back to his side of the table, his expression unchanged, and folded his hands in front of him with the patience of a man who had delivered far worse news in far more dangerous rooms. They had gambled everything, every manipulative tactic, every guilt trip, every weaponized memory of a dead husband on their ability to bully, blackmail, and break a Navy commander. And they had lost absolutely everything. A few short days later, I drove back up the winding mountain roads to Lake Tahoe alone, the windows down, the clean mountain air filling the cabin of my truck with a scent that finally belonged only to me. No champagne, no perfume, no lingering stench of betrayal in the vents. Just pine needles and cold water and silence. I spent the crisp, peaceful morning quietly dismantling the red strobe lights from the ceiling fixtures, unscrewing each one with the same steady hands that had installed them, and carefully packing away the heavy acoustic sirens into padded equipment cases. I pulled the last of Ethan's wiring from the basement walls and patched the drywall with fresh compound, smoothing it flat with a putty knife until the surface was clean and unmarked. I mopped the hardwood floors that had been soaked by the sprinklers, wringing the mop into a steel bucket until the water ran clear. Room by room, I returned the house to a state of perfect, undisturbed calm. The war was officially over, and the enemy had been entirely eradicated from my life. No more midnight phone calls demanding money. No more guilt-tripping voicemails invoking a dead husband's name to pry open my wallet. No more golden child subsidies. No more gambling bailouts. No more $35,000 cars for ungrateful sisters who complained about the color of free leather seats. No more $50,000 checks signed in mourning clothes for a father who patted the deed like a poker chip. Every single financial chain they had wrapped around my neck for 15 years was severed legally and permanently, with the stroke of a pen and the backing of the United States Navy. The property now belonged to the veterans who actually earned their sacrifices, and I would live in it for the rest of my life, under the protection of a contract that no amount of screaming or sobbing or threatening could ever undo. I walked out onto the wooden rooftop terrace, the same terrace where my dad had stood popping champagne and declaring my eviction just weeks before, and I held a hot, steaming mug of coffee in my hand. The bright morning sun crested beautifully over the calm, deep blue waters of the lake, bathing the entire house in a warm, golden light that touched every surface the strobes had once violated. I stood exactly where he had stood, in the exact spot where he had pointed down at my sweat-soaked uniform and sneered, and I felt nothing for him. Not anger, not grief, not even pity. Just the clean, uncomplicated absence of a burden I had been carrying since I was old enough to write a check. I took a deep, unobstructed breath of the clean mountain air, filling my lungs completely for what felt like the first time in 15 years. The parasitic shadows were gone for good. I am a commander, I am completely free, and this fortress is finally mine to enjoy in absolute peace. This level of manipulation thrives in silence, but standing your ground and drawing a hard legal line destroys their power forever. If you felt the incredible relief of this absolute victory, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever delivered a final checkmate to someone who tried to ruin you? Share your triumphant moments in the comments below.